Hello and welcome to the 1/106th of a second photography podcast. In this episode today, we're going to talk about the iPhone 11 and the Canon EOS 90D. They've both been announced and teased, and we're just going to talk about them from a photography point of view. So the iPhone 11 has 2 or 3 lenses, which to me isn't anything remarkable from a phone point of view, but it's probably quite remarkable from an iPhone point of view. The thing that really interests me is the 3 lenses on the iPhone 11 Pro. And it's almost implied that the Pro could be used by a professional. It has a 2-time telephoto lens. I don't think a professional photographer would use that. And certainly you're going to get more versatility with that camera than standard iPhone with 2 lenses because you have ultra wide, wide and telephoto. Your telephoto probably is going to be close to a 50mm equivalent in full frame terms than anything else. But I'm not sure it makes it pro from a photography point of view. I think potentially from a videography point of view, the camera that you're getting in the iPhone 11 Pro is probably the best video recording camera ever on a smartphone. And potentially that's true for the stills capture. The difference between using a mobile phone for recording video and recording from, say, a camera has never been too different, but the difference between taking still images is drastically different. So on my iPhone, which is an iPhone 6s, I can record 4K, I can record up to 120 frames per second, and I can do that on other cameras. And the 4K is probably fairly comparable, and the 1080 is probably fairly comparable to what you see on other cameras. You're not going to get a shallow depth of field, but in terms of recording video, it's probably fairly comparable. And particularly on a more modern iPhone, apart from the shallow depth of field and the low light performance, in good light outdoors, when you probably want a high aperture, there probably isn't a great deal to tell them apart, to be honest. While it's closer to a professional solution for videography, I'm not sure it is for stills. In terms of everyday snaps, looking at all the data and the footage that I've been able to view and obtain, it looks like the low light footage is quite good. This night mode is quite good. The sort of portrait mode should be better, and it should be better because it's using 2 lenses rather than 1 lens and software. So it does look good, and it does sort of fake looking like a professional camera, but it isn't a professional camera. You can't use it with off-camera flash. It's not so good at doing things like long exposures. You don't have the versatility, you don't have the ruggedness, and also it's a pain taking a picture with your smartphone. You've got to hold it in one hand and press a button on the screen. You have tactile functions on a camera. You hold it up to your eye and you press a button, and it's designed to be held in your hand. A smartphone isn't designed to be held for taking pictures. It's designed to be held for taking calls. So as good as the smartphone is, as good as the iPhone 11 is, there isn't a great deal that separates it. And when you do videography with a smartphone, you tend to put it in a gimbal, or you tend to have it on a tripod. And when you do videography, you're always looking at the back of a screen anyway. So there isn't I don't see such a big leap there. I see the leap for stills is big, but the leap for videography is smaller. And recently I've been experimenting with using Filmic Pro on my mobile and filming that way. And I am quite getting into mobile filmmaking on a smartphone. I have other cameras, they do different things work differently, but your smartphone is another photographic and videography tool, but it is better suited for videography rather than stills. It's the camera you always have with you. If you wanted telephoto, you could have your smartphone and you can have a moment lens, for example. So the moment gives a 58mm field of view. The telephoto lens built into the iPhone would do that as well. I'm guessing it's more about convenience. Having one thing without having to bolt things on is much more convenient. You can't leave it at home. It's there, it's always with you. So would I get the Pro version of the iPhone? Well, I have a confession to make. I've always had iPhones. That's not quite true. I had an Android phone and I hated it. It was dreadful. Bought it off a friend and I soon sold it and got rid of it, and I bought an iPhone, and I've stuck with iPhone ever since. And I like iPhone. I have iPad. I have quite a lot in the Apple ecosystem, so I'm probably not going to move away from iPhone. I did hate Android. Interestingly, I've never bought a brand new smartphone. I've always bought a used one. So I'm always quite happy when a new camera comes out, because it means the one I may upgrade to a couple of generations I will drop in price. So I've always bought a used one. So would Would I buy the new iPhone 11 Pro? No. Would I buy the new iPhone 11? Probably not, because it's a lot of money, and it's not as much as a Canon EOS 90D, but it's a lot of money and I don't need it. I have a phone, it works very well. If that phone were to break, that's a different matter. If I drop my phone down a drain or something, then yes, I really might consider an iPhone 11. But not because of its photography abilities and its videography abilities, because I would be future-proof for several years. It's got a high-end A13 processor in. I'd have a good 5 years of using it before it became obsolete, at least. And I could do some good stuff on it. But I wouldn't be buying it for the videography and photography aspect. So let's talk about the 90D. The Canon 80D was a hugely successful camera for Canon. The 90D is obviously the next iteration. It's a strange one, the 90D and the 80D. And I have the 200D, which is a cheaper version of that camera essentially. Now interestingly, I've worked out the 200D is the last Canon SC one to do 24 frames per second, so I'm really quite chuffed I got that before they removed the 24 frames per second for videography. But the 90D is more ruggedly built, it's bigger than your entry-level APS-C. It does 4K filming, it does I think 10 frames per second, but you have to use live view to get accurate focusing. It's got a new sensor, it's got 32 megapixel sensor, it's got 45 AF points. Yeah, I've only got the diamond in the middle on my cameras. So it is a good camera, and it's around £1,000. In terms of the change from the 80D to the 90D, you get more resolution. I think the dynamic range is approximately the same. But this is the quandary that I have with the 90D. Use it with live view, and it's a mirrorless camera essentially, and it works really well. I find this with my 200D. More and more I'm using live view to compose and take my images. If I want to get low on the floor or want to do a shot from a different angle, I use live view. There's no way I'm lying down on the floor, putting my eye to the optical viewfinder. No, I just flip the screen out, use live view, touch where I want it to focus, and the picture's taken, and I've got a really interesting angle. And it's almost like the mirrorless aspect has overtaken the SLR aspect. From what I've seen, you get quicker continuous shooting, and the accuracy is more improved in terms of autofocus in that continuous shooting if you use the live view mode. So that means you've got essentially a mirrorless camera with an optical viewfinder in an SLR body. Now SLRs are very tried and tested. They're very good at photography. They've always worked. It's an unchanged design for many years, but they are becoming more mirrorless. Now, Canon has the EOS R and the EOS RP out as well, and they're full frame cameras and they're fully mirrorless. And there's new lenses for the RF mount. So then I do wonder whether the 90D is going to be the last true SLR from Canon. Is it the last one that's going to come out? It functions very well as an SLR from what I've seen, and it functions very well in the other things it does. It's got a headphone jack, it's got a mic input, it's got all those things you would expect from a high-end camera, even though it's an enthusiast camera. But for around the price, you could get an EOS RP. So what should you do? Should you go for the fully mirrorless option, or should you go for the Canon 90D, which is somewhere between a conventional SLR and a mirrorless camera? One thing to note really is if you pick the 90D, you will be on the EF mount and EFS mount. Now there's loads of lenses you can get for that, but you're not really future-proofing yourself. If you went for the RP around the same price, or splashed out for the EOS R, you would get access to the new lenses, and you can still use the old lenses via an adapter. So you are future-proofing yourself. You are getting a lighter body, but I don't know whether it will match the 90D for continuous shooting and frames per second. I don't know if it will match it in terms of resolution. I don't know how they compare side to side against each other. The way to tell would be, well, to use them or to go over to dxomark.com and use them comparing the same lens and how they output and their level of sharpness and their sensor readings and their perceived megapixel sharpness for the same lens. But I haven't done that, so I can't comment on it, but I can advise you where to go. I haven't done that because I'm not going to buy a new camera. I'm pretty happy with my 200D, I'm pretty happy with my classic 5D and the other cameras I own. I'm not in the market for another SLR, but I do find it interesting where Canon is going. And I probably wouldn't move away from Canon if I was going to buy a new SLR or a new camera. I'd probably stick with them because I've invested in their lenses and flash systems and other things, and I wouldn't want to move away from them. So there's a bit of a quandary there. And again, if you're paying approximately £1,000 for an APS-C camera. You could probably get a full frame for not much more that's a couple of years old. But I would say which one to get or what decision to make depends on your style of shooting, really. Do you need a rugged camera? Do you need an everyday camera? Is wildlife your preferred thing? If wildlife is your preferred thing, then an APS-C body is quite good because you've got that additional crop, which means you've got that additional zoom on your longer lenses, well, on all lenses, to be honest. So there's no easy answer. It's always compromises. There's the compromise of price, use case, future proofing, etc. You might be fed up with Canon and might be moving away from them. I am not. So 2 new announcements there that I briefly talked about that briefly cost roughly cost the same amount of money. If you've got the iPhone Pro and you've got the EOS 90, they're going to be roughly the same amount of money. 2 completely different use cases for them though. Yes, both record stills and yes, both record video, but only one can use apps and only one can make phone calls and send text messages and check your email on. So it's an interesting choice, and I look forward to seeing how well each of those devices does in terms of sales, reviews and other things. But do let me know what you think. Is this something for you? Are you fed up with Canon? Would you be interested in the 90D? Would you go somewhere else if you wanted 4K footage? Would you go to a different manufacturer? Or would you stick with Canon because you've already invested in their lenses? Do let me know. Thank you. Goodbye.